Nobody touched Brant. That was the first rule on the McLeod property, and the only rule that had never been broken. The farmhouse sat about 40 minutes west of Sundre, Alberta, tucked between a wall of lodgepole pines and a gravel road that turned to mud every spring. Margaret McLeod had lived there for 31 years, first with her husband, then without him, and eventually with a rotating cast of rescued animals that gave her mornings a reason to begin. She ran a small wildlife rehabilitation center, nothing official, nothing fancy. A converted barn, a series of mesh enclosures, a landline phone that rang too often, and a chest freezer stocked with ground venison and frozen mice. She had taken in owls with fractured wings, fox kits separated from their mothers by logging equipment, and once, a young black bear so dehydrated it could barely stand. That bear had been the most difficult case of her career. Until now, Brant arrived on the property 4 years earlier. He was not rescued. He was not adopted. He simply appeared one October morning on the porch railing, orange and white, thick-furred and sharp-eyed, with a torn left ear and what the local vet later confirmed were at least 3 healed rib fractures. Margaret left out a dish of wet food, which he ignored for 2 days before eating it at 3 in the morning when he believed no one was watching. He never became affectionate. He never softened. He tolerated Margaret's presence in the way a landlord tolerates a tenant who pays on time, but plays music too loud. He had claimed the barn, the woodpile, and the south-facing window ledge as his own. Any animal that wandered too close received a hiss so sharp it sounded mechanical. The volunteers called him the Little Warden. Margaret just called him Brant. "He is not mean," she would say to anyone who asked. "He is careful." That January had been brutal. Temperatures dipped to -30, and the snow came in sideways, stacking against the barn walls in dense, wind-sculpted drifts. The phone call arrived on a Tuesday evening, just past 6. The sky already black, the wood stove ticking in the kitchen. "Margaret, it is Dan, Fish and Wildlife. We have a situation." Dan Flett was a conservation officer she had worked with on and off for over a decade. His voice carried a tightness she recognized immediately. Something was wrong, and whatever it was coming her way. The cougar cub was approximately 5 weeks old. Female, found alone near an abandoned den site along the North Ram River, severely underweight, partially dehydrated, with no sign of the mother. A road crew had spotted her stumbling across a logging access road in broad daylight, which meant she had likely been alone for at least 2 or 3 days. "We cannot get her to the facility in Edmonton tonight," Dan said. "Roads are closed past Rocky. I need a place to stabilize her, Margaret." "Just a few days." Margaret looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. She could see the faint glow of the heat lamp through the frost-covered glass. She could see Brant sitting on the hay bale nearest the door, perfectly still, perfectly alert. "A few days," she repeated. "That is all I am asking." She paused. The wood stove crackled. "Bring her." Dan arrived just before 9. The cub was wrapped in a wool blanket inside a ventilated plastic carrier. When he set it down on the barn floor, the sound that came from inside was not a growl or a cry. It was closer to a wheeze, a thin, rattling breath that seemed to cost the animal everything it had. Margaret knelt beside the carrier and unlatched the door slowly. Inside, curled against the far corner, was a creature so small it seemed impossible that it could one day weigh over 100 pounds. The cub's fur was spotted, a muted tawny brown dusted with darker rosettes that would eventually fade. Her eyes were open but unfocused, glassy with exhaustion. "She has not eaten since we found her," Dan said. "Refused the bottle twice." Margaret nodded. She had seen this before. The refusal was not stubbornness. It was shutdown. The body pulling inward, conserving what little it had left, as though deciding whether the effort of survival was still worth making. They set up a small enclosure in the warmest section of the barn. Fresh straw on the floor, a heat lamp angled low, a shallow dish of electrolyte solution, and a towel-wrapped hot water bottle tucked beside a fleece blanket. Margaret dimmed the overhead light, and for a long time, the only sounds were the wind against the walls and the faint, unsteady breathing of the cub. It was close to midnight when Margaret noticed the barn door had not latched properly. A thin wedge of cold air cut across the floor. She got up from the folding chair where she had been keeping watch and moved toward the door. That was when she saw him. Brant was already inside. He stood about 6 feet from the enclosure, perfectly still, his orange and white coat stark against the dark wood of the barn floor. His ears were forward. His tail was low but not tucked. He was not looking at Margaret. He was looking at the carrier. Margaret's first instinct was to remove him. Brant, near a vulnerable animal, was unpredictable at best. She had watched him swat a recovering barn owl hard enough to send feathers flying. She had watched him chase a young fox kit into a corner and hold it there with nothing but a stare. But something about his posture stopped her. He was not tense. He was not coiled. His breathing was slow, his weight evenly distributed across all 4 paws. He looked deliberate, as though he had walked in here with a purpose and intended to stay until it was fulfilled. The cub shifted inside the enclosure, a small, involuntary movement, her paw sliding against the straw, and at that sound, Brant did something Margaret had never seen him do in 4 years. He lay down, not against the enclosure, not close enough to touch, but close enough to be seen. He tucked his front paws beneath his chest, lowered his chin, and closed his eyes halfway. Not sleeping, not relaxing, waiting. Margaret stood at the door for a long time, her hand still on the latch. The cold air curled around her ankles. The heat lamp hummed. She did not move him. She did not know why. But something in the way that Cub's breathing changed. Slower now, steadier, the wheeze softening into something almost rhythmic, told her that removing Brant would be the wrong decision. She pulled the door shut, sat back in the folding chair, and watched. By morning, Brant had not moved, and for the first time since she had arrived, the cub was asleep. The first 3 days were fragile. Margaret had seen enough injured wildlife to know that the window between stabilization and decline was narrow, and it could close without warning. The cub, whom she had started calling the girl in her notes, refusing to give her a proper name because names made it harder to let go, showed only marginal improvement. She accepted small amounts of formula from a bottle on the second morning, though she fought the process, twisting her head and batting at the nipple with paws that were still too weak to do any real damage. Her temperature stabilized, her hydration improved, but her behavior remained deeply withdrawn. She pressed herself into the farthest corner of the enclosure, flinching at every sound. The crack of ice sliding off the barn roof, the distant hum of Margaret's truck idling in the driveway, the sharp pop of a log settling in the wood stove 50 feet away in the house. The only exception was Brant. When he was in the barn, the cub's body language shifted. Not dramatically, not in ways that would show up in a report or a photograph. But Margaret noticed. The trembling slowed. The ears, which had been pinned flat against the skull almost constantly, lifted slightly. The breathing deepened. It was as though his presence created a boundary around her that the rest of the world could not cross. Margaret documented everything in the worn spiral notebook she kept on the shelf near the barn door. Her handwriting was small and precise, the product of decades spent recording weights, feeding schedules, and behavioral notes for animals that could not speak for themselves. Day 3. Cub ate approx 40 ml formula. Still refuses solid supplement. Brant present during feeding. Cub did not resist bottle as aggressively. Coincidence possible. Will observe. Day 4. Brant entered barn at 6:15 a.m. Positioned himself near enclosure. Cub moved toward the near wall for the first time. Distance between them approximately 2 feet, separated by mesh. Day 5. Cub stood on all 4 legs for more than 10 seconds without trembling. Brant was cleaning himself 3 feet away. She watched him the entire time. By the end of the first week, Margaret made a decision she was not entirely comfortable with. She opened the enclosure door, not all the way, just enough. The cub did not come out immediately. She stayed inside for nearly 2 hours, watching the open door as though it were a test she did not yet trust. Brant, for his part, was lying on a folded horse blanket near the far wall, doing absolutely nothing. When the cub finally stepped out, one paw, then another, her back legs wobbly and uncertain. She did not move toward the food dish that Margaret had placed nearby. She moved toward Brant. He did not get up. He did not acknowledge her directly, but his ears rotated, tracking her movement, with a precision that suggested he had been aware of her approach long before it began. She stopped about a foot away from him, stood there, swayed slightly, and then she lay down. Not touching him, not quite, but close. Margaret exhaled slowly from the folding chair. She did not realize she had been holding her breath. The relationship between them was not what anyone would call warm. Brant did not groom the cub. He did not curl around her for warmth. He did not exhibit any of the behaviors typically associated with surrogate parenting in domestic animals. What he did was something more structural, more functional. He set limits. When the cub grew bolder and began to explore the barn floor, unsteady at first, then with growing confidence, she would occasionally venture too far. Toward the door, where the cold air seeped in. Toward the stacked hay bales, where a gap between them could trap a small body. Toward the shelf, where Margaret kept her supplies, including bottles and syringes that were not meant to be chewed. Each time Brant intercepted, he did not hiss, he did not swat, he simply placed himself in the path, a solid, immovable presence that redirected without force. The cub would bump against him, seem confused for a moment, and then turn back. It happened so consistently that Margaret began to wonder if she was witnessing something she had never read about in any of the rehabilitation manuals stacked in her living room. "He is not mothering her," Margaret said aloud one afternoon, standing in the barn doorway with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Her friend Louise was visiting from town, standing beside her with arms crossed and a skeptical expression. "Then what is he doing?" Louise asked. Margaret watched Brant block the cub from climbing onto an unstable wooden crate. The cub retreated. Brant returned to his spot. "He is managing her," Louise raised an eyebrow. "Managing. Like a foreman. He does not do the work. He just makes sure the work gets done in the right place." Louise looked at the cat, then at the cub, then back at Margaret. "You have been alone out here too long." Margaret smiled, but she did not argue. She knew what she was seeing. She just did not have the vocabulary for it yet. By day 10, the cub was eating solid food, finely ground venison mixed with a calcium supplement that she seemed to find personally offensive based on the face she made every time she tasted it. Her weight had increased by nearly a pound. She was moving with more coordination, her spotted coat beginning to fill out, her eyes brighter. And then, on the 11th morning, something went wrong. Margaret was in the house making breakfast when she heard a sound from the barn. Not a cry exactly, more of a commotion. A scraping, shuffling noise, followed by silence, then a sharp, high-pitched yelp that sent her running across the frozen yard in her house slippers. She threw open the barn door. The cub had somehow climbed onto the metal shelf unit near the back wall. It was old, rusted at the joints, and it was tilting. The cub's front paws gripped the second shelf, her back legs dangling, her body twisting in that panicked, graceless way that young animals move when they realize they have made a terrible mistake. Margaret lunged forward, but Brant was already there. He had positioned himself directly below the shelf, his body angled sideways, blocking the narrow gap between the unit and the wall where the cub could have fallen and become wedged. He was not looking up at her. He was looking at the base of the shelf, as though calculating the physics of the situation in a way that a 15-pound house cat had absolutely no business doing. The cub lost her grip. She fell. She landed on the straw-covered floor with a soft thud. Clumsy, startled, but uninjured. Brant had not broken her fall. He had not caught her, but by blocking the gap, he had ensured she fell into the only safe space available. Margaret sank to her knees, her heart hammering. The cub scrambled upright and pressed herself against Brant's side, breathing hard. For the first time, Brant did not move away. He let her stay there, just for a moment. Then he stood, walked to his blanket, and lay down as though nothing had happened. Margaret sat on the cold barn floor, her slippers soaked through, and wrote in her notebook with a hand that was not entirely steady. Day 11. Shelf incident. No injuries. Brant intervened before I could reach her. I do not understand what I am watching, but I am no longer willing to stop it. 3 weeks in, and the cub had changed. Not just physically, though the physical changes were striking. She had nearly doubled her weight. Her legs were stronger, her movements more deliberate. The spotted rosettes on her coat were beginning to fade, replaced by a smoother, tawnier shade that hinted at the animal she would eventually become. She was no longer a fragile thing that flinched at sounds. She was becoming something with force behind it. And that was the problem. Margaret noticed it first during a feeding. The cub had been eating from a metal dish, tearing at a chunk of raw venison with a focus that bordered on aggressive. Brandt walked past, headed toward his usual spot near the window, and the cub's head snapped up. Not in fear, not in recognition, something else entirely. She crouched, her shoulders dropped, her eyes locked onto the cat with an intensity that Margaret had not seen before. It was a posture that had nothing to do with play and everything to do with instinct. The deep, inherited programming of an apex predator beginning to surface in a body that was only now strong enough to act on it. Brant stopped. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at the cub. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, neither of them moved. Then the cub relaxed, went back to eating. And Brant continued to his spot, as though the entire exchange had been nothing more than a passing thought. But Margaret had seen it, and it shook her. She called Dan Flett that afternoon. "The dynamic is shifting," she said, keeping her voice even, though her free hand was gripping the kitchen counter hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "She is getting stronger, and her instincts are waking up. Brant has been remarkable. I will not pretend otherwise. But I am starting to worry about what happens when she decides he is not her protector anymore." Dan was quiet for a moment. The line crackled with the static that always plagued rural connections in winter. "What are you asking me, Margaret?" She closed her eyes. "I think we need to separate them." The decision was not made lightly. Margaret spent 2 more days observing, documenting, looking for any sign that the dynamic was stable enough to continue. But she kept seeing moments, small ones, easy to dismiss, that told her the window was closing. The cub batting at Brant's tail with claws that were no longer soft. The way she blocked his path to the food dish, not playfully, but with a weight behind it that Brant had to acknowledge by going around. The low rumble, barely audible, that came from the cub's chest when Brant repositioned himself too close during a nap. These were not signs of aggression exactly. They were signs of something more complicated. The cub was growing into an animal that had no natural place alongside a domestic cat. Her world was expanding, and the rules that had governed their early days together no longer applied. On a Thursday morning, Margaret moved Brant out of the barn. She did it quickly, without ceremony. She carried him across the yard to the house, set him down in the kitchen, and closed the door. He did not struggle. He did not vocalize. He simply looked at her with those sharp, amber eyes and then turned away, as though he had already understood what was happening before she had. That was the part that hurt. Not his resistance, his acceptance. The barn without Brant felt immediately different. Not colder, exactly, though it was February and cold was a constant. But emptier. The cub noticed within minutes. She moved to the spot where Brant usually lay and stood there, sniffing the blanket, circling it once, twice, 3 times. Then she retreated to the far corner of the enclosure and pressed herself against the wall. She did not eat that day, or the next. By the 3rd day, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook open, staring at numbers that told a story she did not want to read. The cub's food intake had dropped by nearly 60%. Her activity level had plummeted. She had begun hiding again, tucking herself into the darkest corner of the barn, her body curled tight, her ears flat. It was as though someone had reached inside the animal and turned off whatever had been keeping her moving forward. Meanwhile, Brant had developed his own form of protest. He sat on the kitchen windowsill, the one that faced the barn, and he did not move. Not for food, not for water, not when Margaret spoke to him. He sat there, perfectly still, watching the barn door through the frost-patterned glass. Louise stopped by on the 4th day and found Margaret standing in the kitchen, arms folded, staring at the cat on the windowsill. "He has been there since Thursday," Margaret said. Louise looked at Brant, then at Margaret. "And the cub?" "Oh, worse. Much worse. So what are you going to do?" Margaret did not answer right away. She had spent 31 years making decisions about wild animals based on protocols, on research, on the accumulated wisdom of people who had done this work long before she had. Every guideline said the same thing: do not create dependency. Do not anthropomorphize. Do not let sentiment override science. But science had not healed that cub. Science had not coaxed her to eat or pulled her out of her frozen terror in those first dark days. Science had not positioned itself between a 5-week-old cougar and a rusty shelf. Brant had done that. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "I think I made a mistake." She opened the kitchen door. Brant did not rush out. He turned his head, looked at the open door, and then looked back at the barn. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing something that Margaret could not see. Then he jumped down from the windowsill and walked outside, slowly, without hurry, as though he had been waiting for exactly this. And now that it had arrived, he intended to approach it on his own terms. Brant did not go directly into the barn. That was the first thing Margaret noticed, and it surprised her. After 4 days of staring at that door from the kitchen window, she had expected him to march straight in. Instead, he stopped at the threshold. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes. His ears moved constantly, rotating, adjusting, scanning the sounds inside. The wind was softer that morning, and in the relative quiet, Margaret could hear the faint rustle of straw from within the barn. The cub was moving. Then Brant stepped inside, but only just. He positioned himself near the entrance, about 2 feet from the door, and sat down. He did not advance toward the enclosure. He did not seek out the cub. He simply occupied the space. Margaret watched from the yard, her boots crunching softly on the packed snow. She did not follow him in. Something told her this was not her moment to witness up close. The reintroduction took days, not hours. Brant seemed to understand, in whatever way a cat understands anything, that the relationship had changed during his absence. The cub was not the same animal he had left. She was bigger, warier, and something behind her eyes had hardened. For the first 2 days, Brant stayed near the door. The cub watched him from across the barn, but did not approach. They existed in the same space without interacting, like 2 people in a waiting room who were acutely aware of each other but unwilling to be the first to speak. On the 3rd day, the cub took a step toward him. Brant did not react. She took another. He blinked slowly. She stopped about 3 feet away, her body low, her tail twitching. She was testing him, Margaret realized. Not physically. She was testing whether he was still the same, whether the rules still held, whether the thing that had existed between them before the separation was real or just a memory she had imagined. Brant held perfectly still. And then he did something Margaret had never seen him do with any living creature. He rolled slightly onto his side, exposing just a sliver of his belly. It was not a full surrender. It was barely a gesture at all. But in the language of a cat who had never shown vulnerability to anything, it was seismic. The cub lowered herself to the ground, rested her chin on her paws, and stayed. The weeks that followed were different from the early days. The dynamic had shifted. Brant was still present, still watchful, but he gave the cub more room. He no longer blocked her path when she explored. He no longer positioned himself between her and the door. He allowed her to make choices, some good, some clumsy, and only intervened when the stakes were genuinely high. Margaret saw it as a kind of graduation. The rules had not disappeared. They had evolved. The cub was no longer a helpless infant in need of constant management. She was becoming a young animal with the strength to make her own mistakes and the resilience to recover from them. But with that strength came a moment that nearly shattered the fragile equilibrium they had built. It happened on a cold morning in late March, when the snow was melting in uneven patches and the barn smelled of wet earth and old wood. The cub was playing, or what passed for playing in an animal whose playfulness looked a great deal like hunting. She was stalking a piece of straw that the wind had blown across the floor, crouching and pouncing with a precision that was, frankly, terrifying for a 3-month-old. Brant was resting nearby, half asleep. The cub finished with the straw, looked around for another target, and her gaze landed on Brant. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. She lunged, not playfully, not softly, with the full, unrestrained force of an animal that was already 3 times Brant's weight and growing stronger every day. Her paw connected with his shoulder, claws extended, and the impact sent him skidding sideways across the straw-covered floor. Margaret, who was refilling the water dish by the wall, dropped the bucket. Water splashed across her boots. She opened her mouth to shout, to intervene, to do something. but Brant had already responded. He was on his feet before the cub could follow up. His back was arched, his fur raised along his spine, his torn ear flat against his skull. He did not hiss. He did not spit. He looked at her, just looked. And the sound that came from his throat was not the mechanical hiss Margaret had heard 100 times before. It was lower, slower, a sound that vibrated with something older than anger. The cub froze. Her paw was still raised from the strike. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, with recognition, as though some part of her understood in that instant that she had crossed a line and that the small orange and white animal standing before her was not prey, was not a rival, was not something to be tested. He was something else entirely. She lowered her paw, sat down, and looked away. Brant held his position for another few seconds. Then he relaxed, smoothed his fur, walked to his blanket, and lay down. Margaret stood ankle-deep in spilled water, her heart beating in her ears. The notebook would later read, Day 58, Physical Confrontation. Cub struck Brant with significant force. No injury observed on either animal. Brant responded with vocal and postural correction. Cub submitted immediately. This was not a fight. This was a conversation, and I believe it was the last one they needed to have. She was right. After that morning, the dynamic stabilized in a way it had not before. The cub no longer tested Brant. She moved around him with a deference that was subtle but unmistakable. And Brant, for his part, seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted, as though the job he had been doing for 2 months had finally reached its conclusion and he could set it down. April came slowly to Alberta that year. The snow retreated grudgingly, leaving behind a landscape of mud and matted grass and swollen creeks that rushed with meltwater. The pines kept their dark green, but beneath them, the first tentative shoots of new growth were pushing through, pale, fragile things that seemed uncertain of their welcome. Margaret had known for weeks that the call was coming. The Edmonton facility had confirmed availability. The transport had been arranged. The cub was healthy, strong, eating well, and displaying the kind of independence that told everyone involved she was ready. Ready for the next phase, a larger enclosure, a gradual reduction of human contact, the long, careful process of preparing a captive-born predator for something resembling a natural life. Margaret did not use the word goodbye. She did not believe in it, not for animals. Animals did not say goodbye. They simply moved, from one space to another, one season to the next, carrying whatever they had gathered along the way in muscles and instincts rather than words. But she packed the transport carrier with extra straw, and she tucked a piece of the old fleece blanket into the corner, the one that still carried the faintest scent of barn and hay and a 15-pound orange cat. She told herself it was practical. Familiar scents reduce stress during transport. Any rehabilitation manual would say the same. She did not write that in her notebook. In the days leading up to the transfer, Brant's behavior changed one final time. He stopped entering the barn, not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply reduced his presence. On Monday, he spent 2 hours inside. On Tuesday, 1. By Wednesday, he was sitting outside the barn door, watching the entrance but not crossing it. On Thursday, he did not go near the barn at all. Margaret found him on the porch that evening, sitting in the same spot where she had first seen him 4 years ago. His fur was ruffled by the wind, and he was watching the tree line with the same alert, calculating expression he brought to everything. "You already know," she said quietly, sitting down beside him on the cold wooden planks. He did not look at her, but his ear, the torn one, rotated slightly in her direction. "You already know, and you are doing it on your own terms, same as always." The wind picked up. The pines swayed. Somewhere in the distance, a truck downshifted on the highway, and the sound faded like a held breath being released. The morning of the transfer arrived under a sky that could not decide between grey and blue. Clouds moved fast overhead, and patches of sunlight broke through at random, sweeping across the fields and disappearing. The air smelled like wet earth and pine resin and something faintly metallic that Margaret always associated with the changing of seasons. Dan Flett arrived early, driving the fish and wildlife truck with the large transport crate secured in the back. He nodded at Margaret as he stepped out, his boots squelching in the mud. "How is she?" he asked. Strong, alert, ready. And the cat? Margaret looked toward the barn, being himself. They set up the transport crate inside the barn, its door open, a trail of small venison pieces leading from the enclosure to the entrance. The cub watched the preparations with sharp, attentive eyes. She was so much larger now than the wheezing, trembling creature Dan had delivered in January. Her coat was smooth, her muscles visible beneath the fur, her movements precise and confident. She looked capable, like an animal that understood, on some level, that the world beyond this barn was enormous and that she was built for it. But she did not enter the crate. She approached it, sniffed the edges, followed the trail of venison halfway, then stopped, backed up, returned to the center of the barn, and sat down. Margaret and Dan waited. 10 minutes, 20. The cub circled the crate 3 more times, but would not cross the threshold. Her tail flicked rhythmically, and her ears swiveled toward every sound outside. The wind, the creaking gate, the distant call of a magpie. Give her time, Margaret said. Dan checked his watch but said nothing. And then, from the corner of the barn, near the door where a thin wedge of daylight fell across the straw, Brant appeared. Margaret had not seen him enter. She did not know how long he had been there. He moved without sound, as he always did, his orange and white body catching the light as he padded across the floor with a slowness that was deliberate and unmistakable. He walked past the enclosure, past the water dish, past the folded horse blanket that still held the impression of his body from 100 afternoons. He stopped in front of the crate, not beside it, in front of it, facing the cub. The cub looked at him. Brant looked at the cub. The barn was absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though the entire property was holding its breath. Brant held the cub's gaze for a long moment. 3 seconds, 5, 7. Then he did something so small that Dan missed it entirely. But Margaret saw it because she had been watching this cat for 4 years and she knew every gesture he had. He stepped backward, 1 step, away from the crate, away from the cub, away from the space he had guarded and managed and presided over for nearly 3 months. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was the smallest possible movement a body could make. But the cub understood. She stood, walked forward, past the spot where Brant had been standing, and entered the crate. She lay down inside, tucking her paws beneath her, and rested her chin on the piece of fleece blanket that Margaret had placed in the corner. Dan moved quickly to secure the door. Margaret helped him carry the crate to the truck. The cub was calm, her breathing steady, her eyes open but untroubled. As they loaded the crate into the truck bed, Margaret glanced back at the barn. Brant was sitting in the doorway, still, watching. She raised her hand slightly. Not a wave, not really, just an acknowledgement of him, of what he had done, of whatever unnameable thing had passed between a feral house cat and a wild animal that should have had nothing in common. Brant blinked once, then he turned and disappeared into the barn. The truck pulled away slowly, tires crunching on gravel. Margaret stood in the driveway until it turned onto the main road and vanished behind the pines. The air was cold against her face, and she realized with mild surprise that her cheeks were wet. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and walked toward the barn. Inside, the space was quiet. The enclosure was empty. The heat lamp was off. The straw was flattened where the cub had slept, and in the corner, Brant was lying on the horse blanket, his eyes half closed, his body curled in the same position he had held on the first night, the night the cub arrived. Margaret sat down on the folding chair. She opened her notebook, stared at the blank page. She wrote 1 line, Day 87. Transfer complete. She is gone. He is still here. Then she closed the notebook. For a long time, neither of them moved. The days that followed were ordinary in the way that only rural life can be. Margaret cleaned the barn, reorganized the supply shelf, replaced the straw. She returned to her regular routines, checking the fences, maintaining the enclosures, answering calls from fish and wildlife about the usual parade of injured and orphaned creatures that spring always delivered. Brant returned to his patrols, the woodpile, the south-facing window, the barn perimeter. He chased a magpie off the porch railing on Tuesday. He knocked over a plant pot on Thursday. He was, in every observable way, the same cat he had always been. But Margaret noticed something. Every morning, without fail, Brant walked to the barn. He did not go inside. He simply stopped at the doorway, stood there, looked in, held still for 15, maybe 20 seconds. Then he turned and walked away. Margaret asked Louise about it one afternoon, over coffee and lemon cake in the kitchen. "He is checking," Louise said simply. "Checking for what?" Louise shrugged. "Maybe he does not know either. Maybe that is the point." Margaret thought about that for a long time after Louise left. She thought about it while she washed the dishes, while she stacked firewood for the evening, while she sat on the porch and watched the sky turn from blue to gold to that deep, aching violet that only happens in the mountains in spring. She thought about what it means to give something everything you have, and then to let it go. Not because you stopped caring, but because letting go was the final act of caring. The last, most difficult thing you could offer. She thought about Brandt standing at that barn door every morning. Not grieving, not waiting exactly, it just remembering. In whatever way a cat remembers, with his body, with his presence, with the simple act of showing up to a place that used to hold something important and standing there long enough to honor it. 3 months later, Margaret received a report from the Edmonton facility. The cub, now officially designated as a juvenile female cougar, healthy and thriving, had been moved to a larger enclosure. She was interacting normally with other animals. Her weight was on track. Her instincts were developing as expected. At the bottom of the report, a handwritten note from one of the facility staff read, "She adapted faster than any animal we have received this year. Whatever you did out there, it worked." Margaret read the note twice. Then she looked out the kitchen window at the barn, where Brandt was sitting in the doorway, perfectly still, perfectly alert, the late summer sun warming his torn ear. She set the report down on the counter. "It was not me," she said quietly. Brandt did not look up, but his ear turned, just slightly, just enough. Some bonds are not built to last forever. They arrive without warning, in the wrong season, between creatures who have no reason to trust each other. They exist for a purpose that only becomes clear long after they have done their work. And when that work is finished, when the trembling stops, when the strength returns, when the crate door opens and the road stretches out ahead, the ones who loved best are the ones who step back. Not because it is easy, because it is the last good thing left to give. And somewhere in Alberta, on a quiet property between the pines and the gravel road, a small orange and white cat still walks to the barn every morning. He still pauses at the door. He still looks inside. He does not enter, but he stays for just a moment before turning away, because some hearts do not forget, even when they were never supposed to care in the first place.